Okay, so in this module, we're going to be looking at short films and documentaries. And I think that this is one of the key ways that, people might have been exposed to Aboriginal perspectives, say, going through school, because a lot of teachers really prefer, to use some audiovisual material as a stimulus. Okay, so if we look at what we did in the last module, we were talking about performance and how that performance might not only be for entertainment. So, thinking specifically there, for instance, about the example of the senior law woman outside of the Wick case, beginning to dance. But one of the things that we're also going to look at in this module, extending that idea, is how these kinds of performances, become really important for cultural expression. So we know that film has been used for a range of purposes. Excuse me. And this includes things like the sharing of creation stories and of life stories. As we talked about last week, there is also often an element of conveying a political message, or recording historical stories. And I think that these things become very important, not just for an external audience, but we quite often see in particular elders who talk about using, film and other recording mechanisms as something that's going to allow young people in the future to access their cultural histories and their cultural knowledges. Okay, and this, sometimes becomes really important when we look at things like Indigenous celebrations and ceremonies. So, for example, we can see that in the 1930s, there were Aboriginal ceremonies recorded, and these materials have been repatriated to communities from archives, and it's allowed communities to reinvigorate those particular ceremonial practices. And we can also see that, Aboriginal humour, tends to take a very specific style, and this is generally referred to as black comedy. Okay, so quite a large proportion of what are generally categorised as the arts, have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation. And this is participation well above, the national averages. So you might see up to 10% of participants in a certain part of the arts who are contributing, whereas they would only, be making up, a maximum of about 3% of the population generally. All right. We've got a link here to Canopy, which does need your student login. But it is an absolute treasure trove of documentary resources, and also some old films that you can look at. So as we go through the course, we may refer you to materials that are available on Canopy. All right. So we know that filmmaking can be used as a craft, okay? And it allows people to develop understanding and empathy, because we start looking at something from another person's perspective. But that's not to say that Indigenous creative peoples only want to tell those particular stories. We can also see, Indigenous peoples or Indigenous characters, within documentaries where the person's Aboriginality is not the focal feature of the experience. And that happens in quite a lot of the roles, for instance, that Deborah Mailman, has taken in more kind of mainstream drama. They're roles in which clearly she is Aboriginal, but that's not actually central and thematic to the story that's being told. Okay, we know that films cover really diverse issues, and that includes things like domestic violence, the stolen generations, homelands movements. Identity, I think, is a real key theme, as well as, a lack of connection or a connection to different traditions. And they also draw together, different artistic elements like music, story, dance, and graphic works. All right. Um, now, one of the things that we've started to see is that, there was always, an Aboriginal performance tradition, but it's only really moved into the mainstream more recently. And really, I think in many ways, become a vibrant centre of Australian filmmaking. And that's really important because we know that representation itself is such a key element for, overturning stereotypes and addressing racism. So on this slide, we just see, not even 1/10 of, the recent documentaries that have been made both by and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and stories. So we'll just now look at a couple of the key creatives. So people like Darlene Johnson, who's a writer and a producer. And she's very inspired by the stories of the people that she meets and the connections that she makes. And when she made the film Crocodile Dreaming, she became the first person to film the crocodile dreaming ceremony. So a lot of what these artists are doing is, firsts in their field, but also, first just generally in the sharing and, if you like, the capture of different cultural discourses. And she was initially motivated to do this as a political response because of the exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the media. And she really sees this as making a contribution to heritage. So we've got a couple of links here that you can follow to show the type of filmmaking that she undertakes. But what she's really hoping is that this is going to stimulate, generational change and generational inclusion in the film industry. So, we certainly hope that that is the case. Another really key creative is Rachel Perkins, the daughter of the late Charlie Perkins, an Aboriginal activist and political figure. And she has a film company called Blackfella Films. Okay, and so they're producing, I think, some really important works, and probably one of the most recent is Redfern Now, which some of you may have seen on TV or through streaming services. Okay. The First Australians, I think, was a really important piece of work as well, because it looked at Aboriginal history, particularly since colonisation, but it looked at it through the lens of Aboriginal people rather than, the traditional, well, this is a historical narrative that happens to include Aboriginal people. And I think that, this was a really important change. So another person really making a difference, I think, is Bet Cole, who's a director, writer and producer. And she uses a really observational style in her filmmaking. And she wants, to use that to try and give a sense that, things look and feel real. And she particularly wants to create really strong stories for Aboriginal women. Okay, so we've got a link here. One of her films is available for you to stream on Canopy. And that comes from 2001, but she still is, current in the industry. Okay, so if you do have the time, or maybe even after the course is finished, some of these things, might be of interest to you to follow up on. Okay, we can also see, the beginning of what's called Songlines on screen. Okay, and this is in its initial phase, 8 short films from the remote regions of Western, Northern and Central Australia. And they talk about connection to land and culture. And that's through a single creation story. All right. And, so that was a collaboration between NITV and SBS. We can also see, a whole range of new documentary examples, things like Our Generation, looking at Bringing Them Home, which is the report on the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So looking at the impacts of that report. We can also see people that are attempting to tell, really quite different stories. So the story of Zach's ceremony talks around, a young Indigenous man who is, transitioning from childhood to adulthood, and how is that still represented ceremonially. It is appropriate for both genders to watch, and we've checked out a lot of this material quite carefully to make sure that you would not be crossing gender norms. Okay, so, there are different film festivals that often have material either explicitly, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content, but also quite often just simply as, part of its general resources. Okay. Then, there's been a whole range of short film. So it's a short film's any motion picture, but that's not long enough to be considered a feature film. So generally 40 minutes or less. And these are, I think, particularly attractive to young Indigenous creatives, who are still in that startup phase. So it allows people really to get a toe in the market and show the skills that they have. And then we've got some examples here, and they really, go across, urban to rural and remote areas. So Dim Sims, which is set in Redfern, or Riding in Between, which is set in Darwin. Okay, and we can also see that quite a lot of these films are quite well regarded within the industry. So they, are often award winners in different film festival contexts. Okay, a quite recent one is Occupation Native, which was a 2017 NITV production. And Tricia Morton Thomas, looks at colonial past and talks about the things that we perhaps should have been taught but weren't. And so it's, it's a satire, as, quite often black comedy tends to be. Okay, so we saw a quote earlier from Warwick Thornton. He's a director, writer and cinematography, and he has produced quite a number of short films and documentaries as well. So there's a link there where you can follow some of his work. Okay, and then we'll look at some other examples. The Dark Side, True Stories from the Other Side, and We Don't Need a Map. Okay, so these are just available on YouTube. They're quite short, if you'd like to follow them up, whereas, some of the other examples that we've given are over an hour. And remember too that if you do come into the university, you can use, the Wi-Fi data in the university if you don't have unlimited, access to unlimited Wi-Fi elsewhere. Okay, so another series that was broadcast on NITV is You Are Here. And so NITV, the National Indigenous Television Channel, provides a whole range of really relevant media for this particular course. Okay, it's also important, though, that we look at what are the protocols for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And Australia's leading lawyer on Indigenous intellectual property is Terry Janke, and she has, in conjunction with Screen Australia, developed a set of protocols that you can access here to start thinking about